Now, we really can't talk about evolution without getting a chance to discuss Charles Darwin. And typically, when you think of evolution, you might think of dinosaurs, paleontology, fossils, all that good stuff. And it is true that a lot of information that we've accrued over the years about how life has changed on our planet has come from fossils and other evidence that's been collected to document this process over the last, few billions of years. But if we focus a little more on Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin was a really interesting guy. He was really young when he started his research, maybe in his very early 20s. And he had an instructor, a teacher that said, Charles, you really have this aptitude for studying science, studying biology. How do you feel about maybe taking a boat trip? This boat trip will take you around the world. We'll spend a couple years traveling, collecting data so that we can analyze this data and see what sort of conclusions we can make about the world around us. And Charles was like, yeah, totally, I want to do it. Went home, asked his dad. His dad said, no, are you crazy? I'm not letting you go on a, 5-year adventure on a boat with, practically strangers. But luckily, the teacher helped Charles Darwin to persuade his dad to let him go. And so he embarked on this adventure on the HMS Beagle. Took about 5 years, went around the world, but spent a lot of time on a set of islands sort of to the west of South America called the Galapagos Islands. And these islands are interesting for a particular reason. They're islands that are kind of close set together, and they're really small. But what's interesting to note about them is that each island kind of has its own floral and faunal set of organisms. It's kind of like its own little universe, each one of these islands. And so what Darwin did is he spent time exploring these islands and collecting specimens from the islands. And he particularly focused a lot on birds, in particular finches that happen to inhabit these different islands. And he noticed a lot of things about these finches, and so he collected specimens. He brought them home, and he spent the next 20 years working on analyzing all the data that he had collected. Now, 20 years, that's a really long time. I spent 6 years on my PhD, and that was plenty. I was done, ready to write my thesis, do my dissertation, and be finished with it. I can't imagine what it felt like to go through and work on the same project for 20 years. But as a scientific community, we're glad that he did. And eventually he published a book that's called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This was published in 1859. And in this book, he made two really important points. Point number one was that species showed evidence of descent with modification from a common ancestor. There's your definition that we use now for what is evolution. But he didn't stop there. He also proposed, gave an explanation for how could this have happened? How could we have started, from that common ancestor and then diverged as time went on? And so he said that natural selection is this mechanism behind descent with modification. And an interesting thing to point out is that what Darwin wrote about in this book really explains the duality of both the unity and diversity of living organisms on our planet, right? Common ancestor, we have similarities, and then descent with modification, we are, though, different. And one more thing maybe to point out is that, Charles Darwin didn't really discover anything that was that new. Scientists had already gathered a lot of the information that he had come up with, but he was the guy that put the puzzle together in a meaningful, understandable, in a way that really made sense to scientists and people around the world. And so let's dive in maybe a little bit further into Darwin's research. And so first thing he did is he made observations. Just like any good scientist, right? You observe the world around you. And the observations that he made was that individuals in a population vary in their traits, many of which are heritable. You've observed this, right? When you sit in the classroom, you go to the grocery store. We are all different, right? Some of us have blonde hair, some of us have brown hair, some of us have black hair. Our skin color is different. Some of us are tall, some of us are short. And the way that we get these traits is that we inherit them from our biological parents. So Darwin observed that too. Kudos to you. He also observed that more offspring are produced than can survive, and competition is inevitable. This is maybe not so much true for humans, but, out in the real world, out in nature, yes, absolutely, right? Organisms will lay a lot of eggs or have a really big litter because not all of them are going to survive. They're going to compete, some are going to be predated upon, etc. And then lastly, he observed that species are generally suited to their environment. One example using his finches is that he noticed that in the islands that had certain type of food, the finches were suited to collecting and utilizing that type of food, whether it was insects or whether it was seeds. There was a match there between what was available and the traits of the organisms that lived there. And then he made some inferences, right? He inferred that individuals that are best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Makes a lot of sense, right? If you are better camouflaged, you are harder to see by a predator, you have a higher likelihood of making it through to sexual maturity, reproducing, and then passing on those beneficial traits to the next generation. And so over time, more individuals in a population will have these advantageous traits. Because if you don't have those advantageous traits, you're going to die. And if you die, you probably will die before you have the chance to reproduce, and you can't pass on the less advantageous traits to the next generation. And so evolution really occurs as this unequal reproductive success of individuals. And this is what Charles Darwin called natural selection. So let's take a look at a very simple example here. If you take a look at the picture, hopefully you see that there are beetles in this picture, and there are 3 different kinds of beetles. Just for simplicity's sake, let's say there are white ones, gray ones, and black ones. The other thing you might notice is that these beetles live in a dark environment, right? It's a black background. And so if you were, let's say, a visual predator that found these beetles tasty, which ones would you probably catch first? Hopefully you said the white ones, right? You're going to go for the easy catch. They're easier to spot. You're going to start eating the white ones. And so the white ones, if they get eaten more frequently, they may not get a chance to reproduce and pass on that white trait to the next generation. And so over time, you'll notice that the population changes, right? Only the black and the gray beetles survive, pass on those traits to the next generation. And after some time, there may no longer be any white beetles because that trait was eliminated from the population. It's important to note, though, that this process of natural selection and evolution takes place over a very, very long period of time. This is not an instantaneous change that you see in an organism. This is a lengthy, maybe multi-generation process that causes change in a population of organisms. And so lastly here for evolution, we get a chance to look at what an evolutionary tree would look like. This example is using the finches that Darwin studied in the Galapagos Islands. An evolutionary tree is very much like a family tree, let's say, except it's kind of tilted to the side. You've got your common ancestor who went through time. Maybe a different population started to change a little bit until they changed enough to branch off into 2 different species. And so each branch here you see now, this is where the original organism changed enough to be called 2 different versions or species of that organism. And so off to the far right-hand side here, we have the currently existing finches, some of which I'm sure that Darwin studied. And so you can see up here, you've got how their beaks are really narrow, probably to help them bore little holes into trees or plants to get under the bark to get the insects from underneath the bark. And then down here at the bottom, you've got the seed eaters. You can see how robust their beaks are, right? This is likely to get those seeds to be able to crack them open to get the nutrients from the inside of that seed.